Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today, and I'm very grateful to the organizers for their warm hospitality and great kindness. And to come in and say good morning. It's also always a treat to be in a country that has ratified the CRPD, and a country which has a very deep commitment to human rights. And I'm sure we're all looking forward with great pleasure and anticipation to seeing the wonderful things that Norway will do on behalf of people with disabilities, both here and through their international development work. Today we're going to talk, appropriately enough, on International Disability Day about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. The CRPD arose in large part because of the historic exclusion of persons with disabilities from their societies and from international law and programming. People with disabilities, it was known at the time that we considered the convention, existed below the poverty rate at twice the prevalence of their population. As far as education, 1/3 of all children of primary school age not in school were thought to have disabilities. 80% were considered to live in the developing world, and yet, the UN and international law basically ignored people with disabilities. The core human rights treaties, of course, apply to all human beings. But apparently, under those early laws, not all human beings were considered equal as far as application of those laws. A study by Special Rapporteur Leandro Despuey in 1997 showed that over a decade of 10 years, there had been only 4 admissible complaints to any UN treaty monitoring body about disability. The Millennium Development Goals, which have 8 goals, 20 targets, and 60 indicators, mention disability 1 time. They're programmed to eradicate poverty by the year 2015, and yet we knew that at the time we said 10% of the world were people with disabilities, and 20% of those living below the poverty line were people with disabilities. The disability did not appear in the MDGs. Education for all, again, was part of the MDGs, and 1/3 of all primary school children not in school had a disability, and yet disability is not mentioned in that MDG as well. And yet now, 2 months ago at the UN, we were talking about post-2015 and what will happen with Millennium Development Goals and poverty eradication. We have General Assembly resolutions saying that people with disabilities must be included. We have high-level meetings at which your Minister of Foreign Affairs spoke as well, in which countries are committing to including people with disabilities in the agenda. Exactly how that agenda will turn out, we don't know. But the fact is, in a mere 7 years from when the convention has been passed, we now have disability front and center at the table as an equal participant. And that is a huge change in just a small number of years. But we did see that the UN had not been including people with disabilities. And there was a movement to try to do that. And 2 countries, Sweden and Italy, in the mid-1980s, moved the General Assembly to consider a treaty on behalf of people with disabilities. At the time, though, the General Assembly pushed back. They said, we have too many treaties. We're working on a women's treaty. We've got a children's treaty. We have others in our sights. We have treaty fatigue, as they said, but there are soft laws and resolutions. Interestingly, if we look at the soft laws and resolutions, you see that many of them are tinged with a medical model or a charity model of disability. People with disabilities should be included, but only to the extent possible. Would we consider saying that for women or racial minorities or others? Even the one instance in core treaties, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 25, that mentions children with disabilities, does so in a contingent manner. They ought to be included in society and in their schools, but only to the extent possible. And so there was a movement at the United Nations. There was 3 prongs to it. There was the political movement. The government of Mexico was the heavy lifter. The government of Vicente Fox, if you follow the convention's drafting history from beginning to end, coincides with the government of Fox in Mexico. He had committed, as part of his agenda, as part of his politicking, to get his party's domination, to push for a disability treaty at the United Nations, and he kept his word. The second prong was, again, the politics of disability not having been included in much of the international programming and human rights agendas. And the third was a bit of an academic document. Gerard Quinn and Teresia Degner, two law professors, and Teresia is now on the committee that monitors the CRPD, wrote a 200-something page report going through the entire UN system systematically and showing where disability ought to have been included, where it was not included, how it ought to be included, and making the case very thematically for why disability needed its own special convention. That report, by the way, is notable because usually when the UN issues a report, this was the UN Commissioner's Office, it was Mary Robinson at the time, the UN seal goes right on top, on the front page, and the authors' names are listed somewhere in the back, maybe on page 250 in the footnote. In this case, Quinn and Degner's name are on the front, and the UN High Commissioner's seal is somewhere inside. It was that thorough and that damning of a report, but always written politely and professionally and thoroughly. So what we have now is the first core United Nations treaty to engage the situation of people with disabilities specifically. It is the first human rights treaty of the 21st century. We can give lots of other names to it, but ultimately what we're looking at in the CRPD is the acknowledgement of the equal rights, dignity, autonomy, and worth of people with disabilities, and the goal to achieve what political scientist Jacobus Kemper called many years ago, the right to live in the world. The right to go wherever everyone else goes, the right to be included just like everyone else, the right to live in the world. The CRPD is also notable for being the first human rights treaty at the UN to have included targeted stakeholders. No doubt women were present during CEDAW's negotiation, no doubt children were present during the CRC's negotiation, but not in their capacity as NGOs, not in their capacity as rights organizations. And here, for the first time, people with disabilities, as the targeted group, were present in the negotiations from the beginning. The theme of nothing about us without us was present throughout the negotiation and is seen throughout the document and is moving the implementation of the convention around the world. People with disabilities were involved from the beginning, in part by accident, because the General Assembly did not commission an ad hoc committee to write a disability-specific treaty. Instead, they commissioned a committee that would go and consider, should there be a disability-specific treaty? And the chair of the first few sessions, the first 3 ad hoc sessions, Luis Gallegos of Ecuador, said, well, if we're going to consider whether there ought to be a treaty specifically affecting people with disabilities, what better way to inform ourselves than to have people with disabilities present? How can we better learn than by having the stakeholders, the people whose lives are affected, tell us their needs, their priorities, help us understand their situation? And so at the first ad hoc session, there were 85 people with disabilities registered to attend. By the 8th ad hoc session, there were 850. Nothing about us without us. And having people with disabilities was also very important because of their formal participation. Before the formal sessions at the United Nations conference room, an International Disability Caucus would meet. All the disability groups, the academics, the friendly NGOs, and all others who wish to participate would join there. And they would look at the articles that would be considered for the day, and they would argue about what they ought to do about it. And just like any other family meeting, there were tears and fighting and hair biting and all that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, there was one voice, and there was one decision. And at the end of each of these formal negotiations, after the states had done their interventions, there was interventions by people with disabilities, speaking to the United Nations, speaking to all the states' representatives from around the world. And this was enormously helpful. People who work at the United Nations, especially the diplomats and the states' representatives, tend to come from very privileged backgrounds, education, social standing. Very few of them had interaction with people with disabilities. Very few of them had ever thought about thematically the idea of disability rights. And having people with disabilities in the room with them, having people with disabilities speaking at the end of each session, relating their experiences, telling them about what it was like to have been placed into a psychiatric hospital, what it was like to have an intellectual disability and not to have been able to open a bank account, what it was like to have been told that you can't get a driver's license, what it was like not to go to school with others, what it was like to have been left by your family who loved you, but who also apparently wasn't that proud of you, in the back room of the house, not to have left for years and years and years. And this had an enormous effect on the state's representatives. Also having persons with disabilities in this inaccessible conference room, participating in this inaccessible negotiation, because when they put the words of the convention on the screen, it was not offered an alternative format to those with visual and other print disabilities. When those who were deaf or deafblind needed translation, it was done on their own and by their friends and by their caregivers, not by the United Nations. When the daily summaries, which told everyone what happened during the day, were issued, they too were not issued in accessible formats. So to have these people with disabilities in the room, interacting with the state's representatives, seeing them come and go every day, handing out position papers, lobbying with them, negotiating with them, trying to get consensus, was enormously empowering and powerful. And we see that work in the text of the convention. We see the voices of people with disabilities, we see their needs, their concerns reflected in this convention. And there were 8 ad hoc sessions. The first 2 dealt with whether there ought to be a convention or not, and if so, what sort of convention there would be. At the first ad hoc session, there was only one nation in the world who was really adamant about not having a disability-specific convention. Unfortunately, I happen to come from that country. During the second ad hoc session, the U.S. continued its position, but here by now it was clear that there would be a convention. The European Union specifically was moving for a non-discrimination only treaty. Many of the developing countries were moving for a development-based treaty. In the end, it was considered sensible and thoughtful and logical to have a holistic treaty, something that both has civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights together, and that is the treaty that we have. There were some highly contested issues during these negotiations. And when you look at the text, and those of us who were there can remember some of the negotiations leading to it, not everyone got their way. This is a document of consensus and agreement and compromise. But there were some contested issues that continue to this day. One very large one is on legal capacity. The idea that people with disabilities have the same legal standing, the same personhood as all others, and are able to use that capacity, are able to make their own choices, are empowered just like everyone else to decide what to do. Legal capacity has been an issue because in most of the world, people with disabilities are often presumed incapable of various functions, whether it's a high-level function such as finance or a more basic function such as deciding where to live or what to eat. And in many parts of the world, people with disabilities to this day are placed under plenary guardianship proceedings. It means that someone is appointed to make all decisions on their behalf. All decisions on their behalf. And this precludes them from doing things like buying property or signing a contract. And of course it precludes them from things like entering into intimate relationships, or marriage, or parenting. Norway is one of the countries that has taken a reservation against Article 12. Of all the countries that have ratified and taken reservations, nearly all, when they reserve against Article 12. And to be fair, in large part, it's because we don't really understand exactly how Article 12 works. People with disabilities assert correctly that we have equal capacity and that we ought to express our decisions. Article 12 explicitly states that states have an obligation to facilitate decision-making when necessary. Many people do not need facilitation in their decision-making. But the actual boundary of how you do that, and where you do that, and where you draw a line, is not understood. The committee itself has come out with a general comment that highlights some of the very basic issues, but the much deeper, more difficult ones. In what areas do you need facilitation? How is facilitation done? How will facilitation ensure that the voice of the person with a disability, that her decision, that what she really wants, is what is being taken to effect? We're all concerned about this, but we actually haven't figured out how to do this yet, to be fair. Another issue that was highly contested at the time was independent living, and in some ways this was cultural, and in some ways this was linguistic. By independent living, which originated in some places in Berkeley, California, and then came over with Adolf Ratzka in Sweden and spread around the world, what we mean is the ability for people with disabilities to decide on their own, for themselves, where to live, how to dress, what to eat, where to go, what to do, etc. It does not literally mean living on your own without other people. But there's two aspects of it that are somewhat controversial. One is the linguistic one, and many traditional societies where people with disabilities live with their families, the representative said, well, wait a minute, why do people with disabilities want to leave their families? Why should they be required to leave their families? They're taken care of. And in many parts of the world, that's true. So here we have also a cultural divide, because independent living as it's conceived of in the West or the developed world often is people with disabilities living with friends, living in communities, living in groups, or living on their own. But in most parts of the world, in the developing world, when you try to find a person with a disability, usually you find them on the street. Very often you find them begging. If they are less lucky, they're locked up in institutions. And then it's a mixed blessing. Most of the time, families who care for people with disabilities are trying their best, and they try to empower them. But sometimes the results aren't very good. We can all tell stories about people who have been locked away by their families, or been prevented from opportunities, or told not to engage in certain actions, or not to have friendships with certain people. So it's a mixed blessing. And here again, independent living is somewhat controversial. And then there was sexual and reproductive health. At one point, there was a separate article on sexual and reproductive health, and to be quite honest, it was very poorly written at its beginning. It said people with disabilities have the right to experience and enjoy their sexuality. Think about that for a moment. How does the state go about ensuring that a disabled person experiences and enjoys his or her sexuality? Well, putting aside the poor writing of it, there were two things that pushed back against this particular article. One was the notion that people with disabilities are asexual, which in many parts of the world has led to some awful consequences. For example, the myth of virgin rape as a way of getting rid of HIV/AIDS. There was a wonderful woman named Gladys Chodorov who worked with women and girls with disabilities who have been subjected to this abuse in Tanzania. She passed away a few years ago. But also because the only American DPO present for many years was the Southern Baptist National Right to Life Coalition, funded by my government at the time. And they, in conjunction with the Vatican, in conjunction with some of the Arab groups, decided that anytime you have the word sexual and reproductive health, it must be abortion. Even though abortion is not a guaranteed right under any sort of UN instrument, even though it has never been listed in the convention, they decided this would lead to abortion. So there was a big pushback against it. The word sexual and reproductive health remained within the article on health, but the separate article is no longer there. Another highly contested article had to do with education, and the tension between most of the disability rights community believing that children with disabilities ought to be included. We use the word inclusive education, we use the term integrated education with other children who don't have disabilities so that they can interact and they should be accommodated within these classrooms. But there was also some movement within the deaf and the deafblind who said for reasons of culture, for reasons of solidarity, for reasons of the best education and the best environment, we ought to have separate schools. And this tension as between separate schools for children with disabilities and between integration is one that plays out for many countries around the world, and it continues to play out. On the content of the CRPD, we see a number of things. We see old rights that look familiar to us and that we can trace very easily back in its lineage to other human rights conventions. So we see things like freedom from torture, political participation, employment, education, standard of living, health. These all look quite familiar to us. We see some rights that look kind of familiar to us, but really are there to enable people with disabilities to activate other rights. So for example, habilitation and rehabilitation are connected to education and to employment. And then although the party line was that there are no new rights in this treaty, it's something that's often repeated, There are some which, if we're being really honest and we look at them, sure seem to us to be new types of rights. Doesn't mean that they aren't wonderful rights, but they don't seem to have linkages in other previous rights. So, for example, personal mobility. Obviously, you need to have personal mobility in order to actually have other rights, but it's not something that we see otherwise, other than moving from country to country. The Article 3 principles that govern the Convention are respect for the inherent dignity, autonomy, and freedom to choose of persons with disabilities, non-discrimination, full and effective participation, equality of opportunity, accessibility, equality between men and women, and respect for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities. Article 5 on equality and non-discrimination recognizes that all persons are equal before the law and no one may be discriminated against, but also that in order to properly eliminate discrimination, in order to bring people with disabilities up to an equal level with those of their peers without disabilities, special measures and other devices may be necessary. And the Convention, following many European devices, purposely points out that in doing those special measures, it is not a form of discrimination under the terms of the Convention. Article 12 on autonomy and legal capacity is again the most controversial and the least understood, and in many ways one of the more important articles under the Convention. I actually worry about hierarchies and don't believe in hierarchies of human rights, but it certainly seems to be one of the more significant ones. If you might recall, in the 19th century, for most countries, and unfortunately today for some countries, women are stripped of their rights, not allowed to decide who to live with, where to live, what to do with their bodies, to dispose of property. The English legal thinker Blackstone said that when a woman entered marriage, she died a legal death. For people with disabilities, often it's been a legal death from the start, and Article 12 is trying to eliminate that. Most of us believe that when we reach whatever the age of majority is in our countries, 18 or 21, it's presumed we can go off and make decisions for ourselves. We can vote. We can enter the military. We can dispose of property. We can go to school. We can make really bad choices about our personal lives as well. But for people with disabilities, because of guardianship, because of often well-intended paternalistic measures, again, we're talking about a shift from charity to rights. Often paternalistic measures, people with disabilities have been stripped of those decisions. And unfortunately, the practical reality and the practical implications of that has been the placing of people with disabilities not only under guardianship, but also in institutions or long-term care facilities. And you're welcome to look on the internet and see the conditions that people with disabilities live in. I've done inspections in about 12 different countries. They range from the humane, and I put those in quotes, in a place like Korea where everyone is well-dressed and well-fed and is well-medicated and has activities during the day, but they can never leave. And when I inspected the Korean institutions with the then chair of the Human Rights Commission, there were two people who kept coming up to our group and hugging us. All they wanted to do was hug. Because human beings need contact. We're social animals, and we need physically to be touched and to feel affection as well. And from there it goes further downhill to stories and incidents well documented of sexual abuse, rape, forced abortions, tying down to beds, being left in bodily fluids, and actually it gets worse from there. So Article 12, the idea that one can represent oneself, that one can make one's own decisions, that one can decide these things is absolutely central to this convention. What we see running through the convention, what we see running through the negotiations and then in the text of the convention is participation as a right. We talked about people with disabilities participating in the drafting of the convention. There's also Article 4.3 that specifically states that when states think about laws and policies and other matters that affect people with disabilities, they are required to closely consult with and actively involve persons with disabilities and their representative organizations, DPOs. Nothing about us without us. And it's a two-way street, because DPOs also have the obligation to reach out to their governments and to say, we know that you're wrestling with this issue. We would like to help you. Let us help you help us. This is our lives. We would like to give you some perspective and some reality on what it's like to have to live under this mandate, or what it's like to live without a particular type of protection. Let us tell you what it is that we need. We also see the right to participation under the domestic monitoring article, and we also see it in cases of international cooperation. And so again, we come back to develop this. As far as reporting or enforcing the CRPD, every state that has ratified the CRPD within the first 3 years needs to file a state report to this committee. It's now a full committee of 18 and has expanded up to its full membership. And these state reports are actually open to civil society. The Convention requires that the information that the state is going to transmit to the committee be viewed by civil society, be open to them. And this has led to both critiques of these state reports and amendments of them, to some internal negotiations between particular states and national level DPOs, but it's also led to shadow reports. And here, just to pause for a moment, shadow reports are the new in thing with the CRPD and with human rights treaties. Technically, a shadow report means that the government puts in this very thick report on every article under the Convention, what it's doing, where it plans to go, how much it has done, what it has left to do, and so on. And a large NGO or DPO or other human rights organization will then go out and do its own research, file an equally large report, and that's called a shadow report. But to do that, you need a lot of money, you need a lot of technical expertise, and you need a lot of time. And we have seen some shadow reports go to the committees already. There was a very detailed one done by MDAC on institutions in Croatia. There was a very detailed one by DRI on Mexican institutions. There was a fairly detailed one on a theme of education by Human Rights Watch. But also what we've seen, in addition to these shadow reports on particular issues, is some very clever communications to the committee, and especially done by the International Disability Alliance. I think what they've done has just been marvelous. They've looked over the state reports, they've communicated with the DPOs in the local countries, and they've raised the attention of the committee, not article by article, but here are 3 or 4 or 5 things that, themes or matters or rights, where we've spoken with the local communities. What the state is saying it's doing doesn't seem to ring true with the local population. Here are some counterexamples. Could you please inquire into it? Can you look into it? This is marvelous advocacy. This is intelligent, efficient, really good advocacy. And then there are other enforcement mechanisms, including national human rights institutions. If you were to look at the local monitoring provision, the requirement for a local focal point for monitoring the convention, it sounds very much like national institutions. The language there is pulled from the Paris Principles. It was very much intended to be national human rights institutions. I can tell you that with full authority because the proposal before the 6th Ad Hoc Committee for Monitoring by the National Human Rights Institutions was drafted at a conference that we convened with experts that we pulled together. It was intended to be national human rights institutions. What we have found through a survey done by the Canadian Human Rights Commission is that very few of these human rights commissions, even the A status ones, are being appointed to monitoring bodies. There are some interesting hybrids. For example, New Zealand has a combination of a disability commission, a DPO, and the Human Rights Commission, so it's sort of a tripartite one. But by and large, we see states going to their ministries of justice, ministries of social welfare. You can tell how progressive the state is, by the way, whether it's the Ministry of Justice or the Ministry of Social Welfare that's going to be monitoring this convention. And we haven't seen as many NHRIs as we would like. Well, what is the practical significance and initial significance of the convention? And I highlight initial because although it's been 6 years since the convention opened for signatures and 5 years since it went into operation, that was enormously fast. The fastest human rights treaty to hit the ground running. It's only 5 years. And we're trying to take apart thousands of years of prejudice and stigma and social constructions. But what are some of the significance? One of the greatest ones, I think, is the expressive effect. The idea that people with disabilities who for their entire lives have been told that they were less than human, did not belong in society, ought to yield the way to other people, are now claiming their rights, coming together, advocating for change. And it's a marvelous experience. I've been privileged to work in about 40 countries. And when you see the people with disabilities coming from all over the country, very often for days and days on inaccessible transportation, staying with friends, coming together, without legal backgrounds, without advocacy backgrounds, but with human values, and being the problem solvers that people with disabilities are. It's energizing, it's humbling, and it also gives me hope for a future of change. People with disabilities are coming together and speaking in the language of human rights. The convention is not magic, but it is an instrument. And people with disabilities point to the instrument and say, the General Assembly, all the nations of the world, adopted by consensus, this human rights treaty that says, I am as good as everyone else. This is a huge sea change. So to put it in practical perspective, in Korea doing a workshop with university students with disabilities, and we did it on employment, because that was what they wanted. One of the members there was a quadriplegic, and his question, in his language, was, well, why should an employer hire me? I'm only worth half as much as a normal person. His words, not mine. And we showed him the convention. We talked about Korea's involvement in its drafting. We talked about Korea's ratification, that his government had agreed to the things in the convention. And his mood changed entirely. He became very emotional. And he said that he was going to go home, and from now on he would tell his parents, his doctors, his teachers, his social workers, and anyone else that would listen that he was as good as anyone else. That's what we mean by an expressive effect. Or we can talk about the Sea Trust in the Philippines, a group of intellectually disabled youth from 13 to 35, who now put on plays at universities and peer groups and talk to them afterwards about what it's like to have been excluded and why they deserve to be included just like everyone else because they're human, just like everyone else. Or we can talk about the parent in the Philippines who took her child from school to school, she was a blind girl, and left her in the back of the car while she went up to talk to the principal. It was to be her first day of school. And in each of these cases, she would come back quiet and not say a word. And the girl in the back, Kiki, knew that she had not been admitted to that school. And after the 5th or 6th time, when Mrs. Fernandez was told, I'm sorry, we don't have the services for Kiki, it wouldn't be fair to her, it wouldn't be fair to the other children, she couldn't restrain herself anymore. She came back to the car and she was crying. And she sat down. And after a few minutes, Kiki said from the back, it's okay, Mom. I know that I belong. We'll find a place. And they did. Most of all, and perhaps appropriate for today, we are going to see dramatic changes through development assistance. The idea of these billions of dollars, $120 billion loaned every year by the World Bank, although they still claim not to be a UN specialized agency, although it's in their charter, please don't ask why. And bilateral agencies under the Article for International Cooperation all must make this dramatic sea change to include people with disabilities in all their programming. We must have inclusive development. So these billions of dollars a year that are spent for all the right reasons, to give employment, HIV awareness, health screenings, buses, courthouses, buildings, will now include people with disabilities. And the change will be, instead of improving everyone's life except for those with disabilities and leaving the disabled behind, we'll start to see people with disabilities included and also raised up from the floor. And this is a great challenge. USAID, with all its policies, still only includes 3% of its programming for people with disabilities. Norway, through the study that was issued last year, 1.6%. It's a huge challenge, but it's a huge opportunity. And the amount of good that can come out from inclusive development is simply tremendous. And you're Minister of International Development at the high-level meeting, committed to doing the right thing by people with disabilities. And I look forward to seeing the results of that. Finally, the effect of the convention and what it means, to put it in real terms again. One of the early talks that I did after the convention was passed was to a group of parents, children who had Down syndrome. And we talked about rights, we talked about human rights, we talked about being advocates for change. And at the end of the session, afterwards, there was one mother who sat there and wasn't leaving, and she had her daughter in her hands. She was a little girl, about 2 years old. And she said, you know, Professor, the rights and human rights, that's all very important, and thank you for doing that, and something that I want to work on. But what I really want to know is, will my daughter have friends? will she have a chance for a decent life? And that's really what the convention is about. How do we change things in the world so that people with disabilities have a chance for an equally good, equally promising, flourishing life? Thank you.